In the quiet town of Brookline, Massachusetts, life seemed perfect for the Davis family. Mark and Olivia, married for 5 years, lived a life that anyone would envy, until Olivia's father, Robert, moved in. What started as an innocent bond between Mark and Robert spiraled into a secret affair that tore their world apart. Lies, betrayal, and hidden passions boiled over, leading to a tragic and violent end. But when a forbidden connection becomes deadly, how long can a secret like that stay buried? Mark and Olivia Davis had what everyone around them thought was the perfect life. They lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, a quiet, comfortable town where neighbors smiled at each other and weekends were filled with barbecues and strolls down Harvard Street. Their colonial-style house on Beale Street was the kind of place that reflected success and stability. Mark worked as a software developer in nearby Cambridge, and Olivia, with her affluent background, had established herself as a respected art curator. The two had been married for nearly 5 years, and in those early days, their marriage was everything you'd expect. Happy, full of love and excitement. Olivia, with her elegant charm and intelligence, seemed to be everything Mark had ever wanted. Coming from one of the wealthiest families in Brookline, she brought not just beauty and grace, but also deep social ties to the community. Life was good for Mark and Olivia. They were the couple everyone admired. But as with many things that seemed perfect on the surface, there were cracks beneath. Slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, their relationship began to change. The small distances grew, and once lively conversations became routine. Olivia was busy with her gallery work while Mark busied himself in his projects. It wasn't something either of them could pinpoint exactly, but could feel the subtle shift. The change became more pronounced when Robert Hart, Olivia's father, moved in. Robert had recently suffered a health scare and needed a comfortable place to recover. Olivia didn't hesitate to insist he stay with them, and Mark, always eager to please, agreed. Robert was no ordinary man. In his early 60s, he was a distinguished figure in Brookline, having spent decades as a lawyer with a charm that could light up any room. Everything changed one warm August weekend when Olivia left for an art exhibition in New York, leaving Mark and Robert alone in the house. The atmosphere between them felt different that night. As they sat on the porch sipping whiskey, the tension that had been building for weeks came to a head. The air was thick with unspoken words, and the usual conversations felt loaded with something deeper. Robert, always the bold one, finally broke the silence, voicing the question that had been lingering between them. "There's something between us, isn't there?" Mark's heart raced. He knew what Robert meant, but he wasn't ready to face it. "I don't know what you mean," he muttered, but they both knew that was a lie. Robert leaned in, his voice quieter but firm. "You feel it too." And in that moment, everything changed. The denial Mark had been clinging to crumbled, and before he knew it, Robert's hand was on his knee and their lips met. What started as a soft, tentative kiss quickly deepened into something impossible to stop. The weekend became a whirlwind of passion, guilt, and confusion. Mark had never been with a man before, and the intensity of his feelings towards Robert terrified him. Yet, at the same time, he felt more alive than he had in years. It was as though all the emotions he had suppressed suddenly burst free. For Robert, the affair seemed inevitable, as if he had always known this was where their relationship would lead. But for Mark, it was overwhelming. The guilt hit him almost immediately. He loved Olivia, or at least he thought he did. What he shared with Robert felt wrong on every level, yet it also felt unavoidable. When Olivia returned home from her weekend in New York, everything felt off. Mark, once attentive and engaged, had become distant and distracted. The guilt from his affair with Robert was gnawing at him, leaving him emotionally drained and unable to face his wife. Every time he looked at Olivia, the weight of his betrayal pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He tried to act normal, but the strain was obvious. His conversations with her became shorter, and his presence felt absent, even when they were in the same room. Robert acted as if nothing had changed, which only made things worse for Mark. When Olivia wasn't around, Robert would flirt with Mark in subtle ways, brushing against him when no one was looking or catching his eye across the room with a knowing smile. It was as though Robert thrived on the secrecy, enjoying the thrill of what they shared. Mark, on the other hand, felt trapped. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, but the guilt was unbearable. Olivia, who had been observing the strange tension between her husband and her father, grew increasingly suspicious. She didn't have concrete proof, but her gut told her that something was deeply wrong. It was during a quiet family dinner one evening that everything came to a head. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and Olivia, unable to stand it any longer, decided to confront them. She set her fork down and looked between the two men, her voice steady but filled with suspicion. "I think we need to talk," she said, her eyes sharp as she studied their faces. She had noticed the way they avoided looking at each other, the awkward silences that hung in the air whenever they were together. "Something's been off for months, and I need to know what's happening." When Olivia finally realized the full scope of the betrayal, it was as if the world shattered around her. The pain, anger, and confusion all collided at once, leaving her furious beyond words. She had suspected something was wrong for months, but to find out that her husband and father were involved in an affair was a blow she could never have imagined. The rage that surged through her was all-consuming. Her face twisted in disbelief, and she could barely form words as she lashed out at Mark and Robert, accusing them of destroying her life, her trust, and everything she thought she knew about them. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. The anger, the betrayal, it was all too much. Robert, always calm and composed, suddenly snapped. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, he grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. The room seemed to freeze for a second as both Mark and Olivia stared at him, horrified, but before anyone could react, Robert lunged at Olivia. The knife plunged into her chest with a sickening thud, and the room filled with her gasping breaths. It happened so fast, so violently, that Mark couldn't comprehend it at first. As Olivia took her final breath, Robert stood frozen, staring at what he had done. The knife fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. His face was pale, his chest heaving as the reality of the situation sank in. Without a word, he turned and fled from the house, disappearing into the night. Mark was left alone in the kitchen, holding Olivia's lifeless body, her blood pooling around him. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Mark's sobs as he cradled his dead wife. In the days that followed, Mark's life became a blur of grief, guilt, and paranoia. He could barely function, haunted by what had happened. The weight of the affair, the betrayal, and Olivia's tragic death crushed him from all sides. He replayed that night over and over in his mind, wondering if there was anything he could have done differently, anything that could have prevented this nightmare. But no matter how much he tortured himself, he knew the truth. His choices and his actions had led to this moment, and there was no going back. So what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.